Hey, welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy tonight's stories. Here we venture into the dark web, peeling back layers of mystery and terror to reveal tales that were never meant to be told. Leave a like and subscribe for more dark web scary stories.
I received a package from a dark web vendor. Inside was a USB stick with a video of me sleeping. Let me preface this by saying I'm not the kind of guy who goes looking for trouble. I have a boring 9-to-5 job, live in a small apartment, and spend most of my free time playing video games or scrolling Reddit. I'd heard about the dark web, sure. Who hasn't? But I never thought I'd have anything to do with it until the package showed up. It was a Tuesday, and I'd just gotten home from work. My mailbox is usually stuffed with the usual junk, flyers, bills, the occasional Amazon package. But that day, there was something different. A small brown box, no label, no return address. It was weird, but I figured it might have been a neighbor's package that got misdelivered. I brought it inside, tossed it on the counter, and didn't think much about it until later that night. When I finally got around to opening it, I wasn't expecting much. Maybe some random gadget or a mistake shipment. What I found was nothing I could have prepared for. Inside was a USB stick. That's it. No note, no explanation. Just a plain black USB stick tucked into some bubble wrap. I remember staring at it for a long time, my brain bouncing between curiosity and that gut feeling, telling me to throw it in the trash. But curiosity won. Of course, it did. I mean, what was the harm in plugging it into my laptop, right? It wasn't like I'd ordered anything illegal. Maybe someone sent it to the wrong address. Maybe it was a prank. So, I plugged it in. The USB had one file on it, a video labeled watchme.mp4. At this point, any sane person would have stopped, but not me. I double-clicked it, and the video started playing. At first, it was just static, grainy gray noise like an old TV that wasn't tuned to a channel. I leaned in, trying to make out any details, and then the image shifted. The camera was in a room, poorly lit, with shadows stretching across the walls. It looked familiar. My stomach dropped when I realized why. It was my bedroom. The video wasn't great quality, but I recognized the layout immediately. The dresser in the corner, the bed against the wall, the cheap IKEA nightstand with the lamp I'd bought on sale. It was my room, no question about it. The camera was angled toward the bed, where I was lying. The timestamp in the corner showed the recording was from the night before. I watched as my own body shifted slightly, asleep, completely unaware that I was being filmed. My heart started racing. I felt sick, my fingers gripping the edge of my desk so hard they turned white. Someone had been in my apartment. The video was short, only about 2 minutes. The camera didn't move, and there was no sound. It just showed me sleeping, oblivious to the fact that someone was watching me. When the video ended, the screen went black, and for a moment I just sat there, staring at my laptop, trying to process what I'd just seen. I felt violated, angry, terrified. My mind raced with questions. Who had done this? How had they gotten into my apartment? Why me? I checked the file details, hoping to find some kind of clue, anything that could tell me where this had come from. But there was nothing. No metadata, no creation date, just the file itself. It was like it had been scrubbed clean. That's when I noticed something else. A new folder had appeared on my desktop, one I hadn't created. The name of the folder was a string of random characters, a 72F9XQ, or something like that. My stomach sank. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. Inside the folder was another video. This one didn't have a title. I hovered over it, my finger hesitating on the mouse. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stop, to unplug the USB and throw it out the window. But I couldn't. It was like I was trapped, like I had to know what was on that video. So I opened it. The video started in the same room, my bedroom, but this time, the camera was moving. Someone was walking toward the bed. The timestamp showed it was still from the night before, just a few minutes after the first video ended. My hands were shaking as I watched the camera move closer to the bed, to me. The person holding the camera didn't make a sound. No footsteps, no breathing, just the faint hum of static in the background. They stopped next to the bed, standing over my sleeping body. The camera lingered there for a moment, and then the screen went black. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't breathe. My apartment suddenly felt too small, too quiet. That's when I noticed it. The lamp on my nightstand, the one in the video, was turned slightly to the left. I hadn't touched it. I knew I hadn't. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had stood next to my bed while I was sleeping, and they'd left me a USB stick with proof. I unplugged the USB and threw it across the room. My brain was screaming at me to get out, to call the cops, to do something, but I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed, like if I stayed still, whoever had been there wouldn't come back. But then I heard it, a faint sound coming from the hallway outside my apartment. A knock. Software deliberate. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears. And then a voice, low and calm, called my name. Jason. It was my own voice. The voice outside my door sent a chill down my spine. Hearing your own name spoken is unsettling enough, but when it's your own voice calling out, something primal kicks in. My brain went into overdrive, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe it was a prank, someone using a voice recording, or some kind of app. That seemed like the logical explanation, but the situation felt anything but logical. I stayed frozen, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 precise raps, evenly spaced, like whoever or whatever it was knew I was listening. My apartment felt smaller with each passing second, the walls closing in around me. I grabbed my phone from the desk, my fingers fumbling to unlock it. Calling the cops felt like the smart thing to do, but I stopped myself. What was I going to say? "Hi, officer. Someone broke into my apartment, filmed me sleeping, and now they're using my voice to scare me. They'd probably think I was on something." The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, a door closing. But there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I crept toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The peephole was right in front of me, but I couldn't bring myself to look through it. Then my phone buzzed in my hand. The sound nearly made me jump out of my skin. I glanced down and saw a notification. New email. It was from an address I didn't recognize. A random jumble of letters and numbers that didn't look like a real name. The subject line was blank. My gut told me not to open it, but I couldn't help myself. I tapped on the email, and a single line of text stared back at me. "You should answer the door." My breath hitched. My grip on the phone tightened as I backed away from the door. My mind raced, trying to figure out how they knew I was here. Were they watching me right now? I scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. A hidden camera, a cracked window, but everything looked normal. Too normal. I forced myself to look back at the door. The peephole seemed darker than it should have been, like something was blocking the other side. My stomach turned as I realized what it might be. I didn't want to know. I stepped back farther, my eyes darting toward the window. Maybe I could climb out and make a run for it. I lived on the 2nd floor, but it wasn't a big drop. Then again, I had no idea if whoever was outside was alone. For all I knew, there could be more of them waiting below. Another knock. This one wasn't soft or measured. It was hard and deliberate, rattling the door in its frame. My chest tightened as the voice came again, louder, clearer, and impossibly close. Jason. It wasn't coming from the hallway this time. It was inside the apartment. I spun around, my back against the door. The room was empty, the shadows cast by the streetlights outside stretching across the floor, but something felt off. The air was heavier, colder. It smelled faintly of metal, sharp and tangy. My eyes darted toward the USB stick lying on the floor where I'd thrown it. I don't know why I did it, but I grabbed the USB and plugged it back into my laptop. Part of me thought, maybe it held the key to understanding what was happening. Maybe there was something I'd missed. The screen lit up, and a new folder appeared, unprompted. It didn't have a name this time, just a single icon, a plain black circle. I clicked it. A video opened, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The footage was live. It was me, sitting in my apartment, staring at the screen. The camera angle wasn't from my laptop. It was from somewhere else in the room, higher up, like it was being filmed from the ceiling. My heart raced as I glanced around, trying to find the source, but I couldn't see anything. Then I noticed something in the video. Behind me, near the door, the shadows were moving, slowly, deliberately, stretching and curling like smoke. My breath caught as a figure began to form, its edges blurred and undefined, like it was stepping out of a dream. I didn't want to turn around. Every fiber of my being told me not to, but I couldn't help it. I turned my head, my eyes locking onto the empty space where the figure should have been. There was nothing there, but in the video, it was still moving closer. I slammed the laptop shut and stumbled back, my legs giving out as I fell against the couch. The air in the room felt suffocating now, pressing against my chest like I was being buried alive. My phone buzzed again and I fumbled to grab it, the screen lighting up with another email. "Stop hiding. Look behind you." I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I gripped the phone, its light the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But before I could stop myself, I turned, and there it was, a figure standing in the corner of the room. Its face was wrong, familiar but twisted, like someone had tried to recreate me from memory and failed. Its head tilted slightly, and then it smiled. "Jason," it said in my own voice. The thing standing in the corner smiled wider, its teeth unnaturally sharp and too many for its mouth. My legs felt like they'd turned to jelly, but I managed to push myself back against the couch, putting as much distance between us as possible. It didn't move, but the way it tilted its head reminded me of a predator sizing up prey. What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely audible. It didn't answer. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward. The movement was wrong, too fluid, like its joints weren't connected properly. It stopped after a single step, its head tilting in the opposite direction. The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching toward it, like they were drawn to its presence. My phone buzzed again, the vibration loud in the suffocating silence. I glanced down at the screen, and my heart sank. Another email. "Don't speak to it. Leave now." I didn't need to be told twice. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and I bolted toward the door, ignoring the way my vision blurred and my chest tightened. I could hear it behind me, its breathing low and rasping, like it was struggling to draw air. The sound sent chills racing down my spine, but I didn't dare look back. The deadbolt stuck for a moment, my sweaty hands fumbling to twist it open. I yanked the door open and practically threw myself into the hallway. The air felt lighter out here, less oppressive, but my relief was short-lived. The light in the hallway flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the shadows shift behind me. I didn't stop running. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Calling the cops still didn't seem like an option, not when I couldn't explain what was happening without sounding insane. My neighbors wouldn't help either. Most of them didn't even know my name. By the time I reached the building's front door, I was shaking so badly I could barely push it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I stumbled out onto the sidewalk. The city felt quiet, eerily so, as if the world was holding its breath. I looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the street was empty. Then my phone buzzed again. My stomach turned as I pulled it from my pocket, dread pooling in my chest. Another email. This one had an attachment. The subject line read, "Look closely." Against every instinct I had, I tapped on the attachment. It was a photo, grainy, poorly lit, but unmistakable. It was the hallway I'd just run through, the camera angle positioned near the stairwell. The timestamp was from seconds ago. In the photo I could see myself, halfway down the stairs, looking over my shoulder. But I wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing at the top of the stairs. Its head was tilted, that same too wide smile stretched across its face. I looked back toward the building, my heart hammering. The windows were dark, the door shut tight. There was no sign of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me. I needed to get somewhere crowded, somewhere safe. The diner down the street came to mind. It was open 24 hours, and there were always people inside. I shoved my phone into my pocket and started running, my footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. Every shadow felt alive, every flickering streetlight a warning. By the time I reached the diner, I was drenched in sweat and out of breath. The neon sign buzzed faintly above the door, casting a sickly red glow over the sidewalk. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the warm air hitting me like a wave. The place was almost empty, just a couple of people sitting in booths and a bored-looking waitress leaning against the counter. I slid into a booth near the back, my hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment I felt safe. The light, the noise of the kitchen, the presence of other people. It was enough to make me believe I'd left whatever that thing was behind. But then my phone buzzed again. My hands shook as I pulled it out, dread pooling in my stomach. Another email, this time with a single word in the subject line. Found. I didn't want to open it. Every part of me screamed to delete it, throw my phone away, run. But I tapped on it anyway. The email was blank, except for another attachment. A video. My finger hovered over it, my mind racing with what it might show. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that. But curiosity, or maybe some twisted sense of inevitability, got the better of me. The video was live. It was filming me, sitting in the diner booth, staring at my phone. The angle was from outside, through the glass window behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The window was dark, the reflection of the diner lights obscuring the view outside. But as I stared, the glass began to fog, a faint outline appearing, a handprint smudged and pressed against the glass, followed by another, and then, in the condensation, a single word appeared, written slowly, deliberately. Jason. I bolted out of the booth, the chair screeching against the tile floor. The other patrons turned to look at me, their faces a mix of confusion and annoyance. The waitress raised an eyebrow, but I didn't stop to explain. I ran out the door, the bell above it jingling loudly. The street was empty again, the faint glow of the diner's neon sign casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The air was cold and sharp, each breath burning my lungs. I glanced around, my eyes darting to every dark corner, every alley. Then I saw it, The figure was standing under the streetlight at the far end of the block, its head tilted, its smile impossibly wide. And this time, it didn't stay still. It started walking toward me. The figure moved with an unnatural, almost gliding motion, its smile frozen in place like a mask. My breath caught in my throat as it stepped into the dim glow of the streetlight. Its features were clearer now, eerily close to mine, but wrong. Its eyes were too wide, and its skin seemed stretched too tightly over its face, like it had been made to look like me but didn't quite fit. It tilted its head, almost curiously, and then it started moving faster. I didn't think. I ran. The cold air burned my lungs as I sprinted down the sidewalk, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty streets. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The idea of seeing it closing the distance was too much. My mind raced, trying to piece together a plan, any plan, but all I could focus on was the sound. That faint, uneven shuffle, just behind me, growing louder. I turned the corner sharply, nearly slipping on the damp pavement, and ducked into an alley. My chest heaved as I pressed myself against the cold brick wall, the shadows of the narrow space swallowing me. I strained to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat, listening for its footsteps. Silence. For a moment I thought I'd lost it. I tried to catch my breath, my back pressed hard against the wall, my fingers gripping the rough brick. The alley stretched out in both directions, one end leading back to the street, the other to a chain-link fence. Then I heard it. Not footsteps this time, but a faint rhythmic tapping, the sound of fingers drumming against a surface, deliberate and mocking. It echoed off the walls, coming from somewhere behind me. My body froze as I realized the sound wasn't getting louder or closer. It was everywhere, surrounding me, and then, from the shadows at the far end of the alley, it emerged. The figure stepped into the faint light, spilling from a distant street lamp, its head still tilted, its movements jerky and wrong. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It knew I had nowhere to go. My stomach twisted as it raised one long, thin arm and pointed directly at me. "Jason," it said in my voice, but distorted, layered with something deeper and colder. I bolted toward the other end of the alley, adrenaline kicking in as I scrambled over the chain-link fence. The metal rattled under my weight, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it might give way. But I made it over, dropping hard onto the other side. My ankle twisted painfully, but I didn't stop. I limped down the narrow alleyway, pushing through trash bags and broken crates, my pulse thundering in my ears. Behind me, the tapping started again. It was closer now, faster, echoing through the tight space like it was chasing me from every direction. I reached the end of the alley and stumbled onto another street, the lights flickering ominously above me. My ankle throbbed with every step, but I kept moving, glancing over my shoulder for any sign of the figure. The street was empty. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I'd outrun it. Maybe it was gone. Then my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what new horror awaited me. But my hand moved on its own, pulling the phone from my pocket. Another email, this one with a video attachment. My heart sank as I opened it. The video was from a live feed, shaky and poorly lit. It showed me, standing in the middle of the empty street, staring at my phone. The camera panned slowly, and I realized it was coming from above, from a window or rooftop. My stomach turned as the camera zoomed in, focusing on something behind me. I turned, my blood running cold. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the streetlight's glow, its head tilted in that unnatural, almost curious way. But it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures lined the street, their forms flickering like static, their faces just out of focus. They stood silently, unmoving, their heads tilted in unison as they stared at me. The air around them seemed darker, heavier, like it was being pulled into their presence. The tapping started again, louder this time, like it was coming from inside my head. I stumbled back, my legs barely holding me up, and turned to run again. The figures didn't move at first, but as I sprinted down the street, I felt them following, their presence pressing down on me like a weight. I could hear them now, soft whispers, faint and disjointed, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I ducked into another alley, my lungs burning, my vision blurring from the effort. My ankle screamed in protest, but I forced myself to keep going, turning corner after corner until I was completely disoriented. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. Every street looked the same, every building unfamiliar. Finally, I collapsed against a wall, my body trembling, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had stopped, and the alley was silent again. For a moment, I thought I was safe, and then I realized I wasn't alone. The figure stood at the end of the alley, silhouetted against the faint light of a flickering street lamp, its head tilted as it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Behind it, more figures began to emerge, their forms flickering and shifting like static. My phone buzzed one last time. I didn't need to look to know what it said, but I did anyway. The email was blank, except for one line of text. There's nowhere left to run. The figures closed in, their distorted smiles the last thing I saw before the shadows swallowed me whole. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold pavement. My head throbbed, and the world around me felt off. Too quiet, too still, like the city had stopped breathing. The shadows on the walls seemed longer, darker, and the air carried a metallic tang that made my stomach turn. I pushed myself up, my hands scraping against the rough concrete. My phone was lying next to me, the screen cracked but still glowing faintly. The last email was still open. The words, "There's nowhere left to run," staring back at me. My first thought was to call for help, but as I looked around I realized I was completely alone. The streets were empty, the buildings dark. It was like I'd been dropped into a ghost town. The only sound was the faint hum of the wind, carrying with it a sense of dread that settled deep in my chest. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, unsteady. Every part of me ached, like I'd been running for hours. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what had happened. The figures, the emails, the video, they all felt like fragments of a nightmare, something too surreal to be real. But the pain in my ankle and the cuts on my palms told me otherwise. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the street, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. My heart pounded as I took a step back, my pulse roaring in my ears. The figure didn't follow, but its presence was suffocating, like the air itself was pressing down on me. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down, dread pooling in my stomach. Another email. This one had a subject line, "Your final message." My hands trembled as I opened it. The body of the email was empty, but there was an attachment, a video. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to delete it and run. But where would I go? I tapped on the file, and the screen filled with the static before the video started playing. It was me, sitting in my apartment, staring at my laptop, the USB stick plugged in. The video rewound, showing the figure in the corner, the one that had smiled at me. It rewound again, showing the package being delivered to my doorstep, and then it rewound even further. The camera shifted, showing something I hadn't seen before. It was me, lying in bed, sleeping, while the figure stood over me. But this time, it wasn't holding the camera. It was standing perfectly still, its head tilted, its hand raised toward the ceiling. The camera turned slowly, its lens panning upward, and that's when I saw it. Another figure on the ceiling, clinging to the surface like a spider, its face obscured by shadows. It was watching everything, watching me. The video stopped abruptly, the screen going black. For a moment I thought it was over, but then a new image appeared. It was a live feed, the angle showing me standing in the middle of the empty street, staring at my phone. My breath caught in my throat as the camera zoomed in, focusing on my face. And then the voice came. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. My name, over and over, in a chorus of voices that weren't mine. Jason, Jason, Jason. It echoed in the stillness, bouncing off the empty buildings around me. The figure at the end of the street began to move, its body jerking unnaturally with each step. More figures emerged from the shadows, their forms shifting and flickering like static. They surrounded me, their hollow eyes and twisted smiles all fixed on me. My phone buzzed one last time. Another email. This one was from my own address. The subject line read, "You belong to us now." The figures closed in, their hands reaching out, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The last thing I saw before the world went dark was my own face, smiling back at me from every shadow. Now I'm here. I don't know where here is. The shadows never stop moving, and the whispers never stop calling my name. My phone is gone, but I can still feel it buzzing in my pocket, even though there's nothing there. And the worst part, I'm not alone. The figures are always watching, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Their smiles never fade, and their whispers never stop. And every so often, one of them steps closer, tilts its head, and asks a question I can't answer. Why do you look like us? I found a dark website that lets you buy bad luck. I bought a small dose for a joke, and now I can't stop seeing shadows in the corners of my eyes. I'm not proud of how much time I spend online. Most nights after work, I sit in my room with the lights off, scrolling through forums, watching weird YouTube videos, or getting lost in rabbit holes about conspiracy theories. It's not exactly productive, but it keeps me distracted. A few weeks ago, I stumbled onto a post that changed everything. It was on a thread about the deep web. You know, the usual urban legend stuff. Hitmen for hire, cursed items, and all the creepy things you're not supposed to mess with. Most of it sounded like BS, but one comment stood out. This site sells bad luck. It read, "Not even kidding. You pay, you pick how much, and then shit just starts going wrong." They call it experiences, but it's basically a curse. Small doses are like losing your wallet. Big doses? Don't even think about it. It had a link. I knew I shouldn't click it. Everyone knows the deep web is crawling with scams, hackers, and worse. But curiosity got the better of me. The site was called Misfortune Market. The homepage was simple. Black background, white text, no images. A short paragraph explained how it worked. Choose your dose of bad luck. Experience life's unexpected twists and turns. All purchases are final. There were 3 options. Small dose, $5. Medium dose, $25. Full dose, $100. It felt like a joke, but the simplicity of it made my skin crawl. No elaborate design, no flashy gimmicks. Just a few lines of text and a PayPal link. For a moment I hovered over the close tab button, ready to walk away. But then, out of nowhere, I heard Nate's voice in my head. "You're no fun. My best friend always says when I back out of dumb dares. I sighed, grabbed my wallet, and bought the small dose. $5 felt like a safe gamble. The confirmation message was instant. Thank you for your purchase. Your experience will begin shortly. I waited for something to happen. A jump scare, a redirect to some creepy video, but the screen just went black. That was it. Scam, I muttered, rolling my eyes. $5 down the drain. But the next morning, I woke up late. It wasn't unusual for me to oversleep, but this was different. My phone alarm had reset itself to 4 p.m. for no reason, and my backup clock had stopped working completely. I rushed to get ready, but my keys were missing. I found them in the fridge. By the time I got to work, my boss was furious. I'd never been late before, but now she was watching me like a hawk, waiting for me to screw up again. Just a bad morning, I told myself. Coincidence. But the next few days weren't any better. It started small. My coffee would spill before I even got to take a sip. Emails I swore I'd sent would disappear from my outbox. My debit card got declined, even though I'd just been paid. And then there were the shadows. At first I thought it was just my imagination. You know, the way your brain tricks you into seeing movement when you're tired. But these weren't normal shadows. They moved when I wasn't looking directly at them, darting across the edges of my vision, always just out of focus, like they knew I was trying to catch them. I started keeping the lights on at night, but it didn't help. If anything, it made it worse. The turning point came on the 5th day. I was in my kitchen, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint tapping sound. I froze, my heart pounding. It sounded like it was coming from the window, but I lived on the 3rd floor. Slowly I turned my head, half expecting to see a branch or a bird or something normal, but there was nothing there, just the empty darkness of the alley below. The tapping stopped, and then faintly, I heard something that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like a whisper, soft and garbled, as if someone was speaking just below the range of hearing. It came from the corner of the room, where the shadows were. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I wasn't alone, like something was standing just out of sight, waiting for me to look. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I went back to the site, determined to find some kind of customer service link or way to reverse the purchase. But the site was gone. All I got was an error message. This page no longer exists. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. The confirmation email was gone too. It was like the site had erased itself from existence. I tried to tell Nate about it later that day, but he just laughed. "You probably got a virus," he said, slapping me on the back. But that night, he called me. He sounded panicked, his words spilling out so fast I could barely keep up. "There's something in my apartment," he said. "I don't know what it is, but it keeps moving around when I'm not looking. I swear I saw it in the mirror. You've got to come over." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told him about the shadows. I didn't want to go to Nate's place. I thought about making up an excuse, saying I was busy or sick, or that my car wouldn't start. But the fear in his voice wouldn't let me. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. Nate's apartment was on the top floor, and normally the windows let in tons of light. But that night the shadows felt thicker, heavier, like the darkness was trying to press its way inside. Nate opened the door before I could knock. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Thanks for coming," he muttered, pulling me inside. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been screaming. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he led me to the living room and pointed at the mirror on the far wall. "Watch it," he said, backing away like the thing might attack him. I stared at the mirror for what felt like forever. It was just a cheap, full-length mirror with a wooden frame. Nothing special. But as I kept watching, I started to see it. The shadows. At first it was subtle, like a trick of the light. But the longer I looked, the more I realized they were moving. Slow, deliberate shifts, like something was pacing just out of view. "It's been like that all day," Nate said, his voice shaking. I thought I was losing it, but now it's worse. "What do you mean worse?" I asked, my eyes still locked on the mirror. "Come here." He led me to his bedroom. The air was colder in there, and the smell of dampness lingered, even though the windows were closed. Nate pointed to his desk, where his laptop was sitting open. The screen was black, except for one line of text. "Your experience has been upgraded." "What the hell?" I muttered, leaning closer. The cursor blinked once and a new line appeared. "Enjoy your medium dose." Nate let out a nervous laugh, the kind people make when they're trying not to scream. "I didn't even buy anything," he said. "This isn't my fault." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. "It's connected to me," I said quietly. "The sight, the shadows. It's because of the joke I made." Nate gave me a look, somewhere between confusion and terror. "What are you talking about?" I told him everything, about the misfortune market, the bad luck purchase, and how the shadows had started following me. By the time I finished, he was pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. "So what? You dragged me into this by coming here?" he snapped. "I didn't know it would spread," I shot back. "I didn't even know it was real." Our argument was cut short by the sound of glass shattering. We froze, staring at each other, neither of us daring to move. The sound had come from the living room. Nate grabbed a baseball bat from under his bed, and I picked up a heavy lamp from his desk. Slowly, we crept back down the hallway, our footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. The mirror was shattered. Shards of glass littered the floor, glittering in the dim light. But it wasn't just broken. It was empty. The wooden frame hung on the wall, but there was no reflection, no glass, just a void. Nate took a step back, his face pale. That doesn't make sense," he whispered. And then we saw it. The shadows spilled out of the void, spreading across the walls like ink. They moved too fast to follow, darting and twisting, but I swear I saw shapes, limbs, hands, faces, forming and disappearing in the darkness. One of them stopped. It clung to the far corner of the room, its shape shifting like smoke. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It had eyes. They were pale and empty, like the surface of a dead moon, but they were locked on us. "Get out," I whispered, grabbing Nate's arm. He didn't argue. We bolted for the door, the sound of glass crunching under our feet. But before we reached the hallway, the apartment went silent. You know that kind of silence that feels alive. The kind that makes your ears ring because it's so unnatural. That's what it was like. And then from behind us we heard it. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Soft, guttural, and wrong. "Stay." Nate stopped dead in his tracks, his grip on the bat tightening. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. Slowly we turned around. The shadows were gone, but standing in the center of the room, surrounded by shards of broken glass, was a figure. It wasn't human. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and its skin, if you could call it that, was black and glossy, like oil. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless surface where its eyes and mouth should have been. But it was watching us. I could feel it, like needles pressing into the back of my neck. The thing tilted its head. its movements slow and deliberate, and then it raised one long, clawed hand. It pointed at Nate. He didn't wait to see what it would do next. Dropping the bat, he bolted for the door, dragging me with him. We didn't stop running until we reached my car. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died, and from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The shadows. They were waiting for us. I fumbled with the car keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice before finally jamming them into the ignition. The engine sputtered again, coughing like it was on its last breath. Come on, I muttered, glancing at Nate. He was gripping the dashboard, his face pale and his eyes wide as he stared at something behind us. They're still there, he whispered. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. In the rearview mirror, the shadows were pooling together, crawling across the pavement like ink. They moved unnaturally, twisting and folding in ways that made my stomach churn. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, skidding out of the parking spot. Go, Nate shouted. The tires screeched as I pulled out of the lot, the car jerking violently as I swerved onto the main road. For a moment I thought we'd made it. The shadows didn't seem to be following us, and the lights from the street lamps felt almost comforting after the oppressive darkness of Nate's apartment. But then I noticed something. The streetlights weren't right. They flickered erratically, their yellow glow pulsing like a heartbeat. And the road seemed longer than it should have been. Where are we? Nate asked, his voice shaky. I glanced around, my chest tightening. The familiar landmarks, the gas station, the diner, the old library, were gone. The street was empty, stretching endlessly into the darkness. This doesn't make sense, I said, gripping the wheel tighter. We should have hit Main Street by now. Nate didn't respond. He was staring out the window, his face pressed against the glass. What is that? He whispered. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. The shadows were back. They were spilling out of the alleys and side streets, sliding across the pavement like smoke. But they weren't just behind us anymore. They were ahead of us, too, lining the sides of the road. And they weren't just moving, they were watching. The pale, empty eyes were back, dozens of them blinking in and out of existence within the darkness. They followed the car's every move, unblinking and hungry. Faster, Nate said, his voice barely above a whisper. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as the car sped down the endless road. The shadows seemed to blur together, their shapes stretching and twisting like they were trying to reach for us. And then, up ahead, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, completely still, its long, spindly limbs silhouetted against the flickering lights. Its head was tilted to the side, as if it were curious, and its arms hung unnaturally long, almost touching the ground. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding wildly. Nate screamed as we spun, the tires screeching against the pavement. When we came to a stop, the figure was gone, but the road was blocked. The shadows had closed in behind us, forming an impenetrable wall of darkness. Ahead, the figure reappeared, its featureless face turned toward us. "What does it want?" Nate whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't have an answer. My heart was pounding, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel. The figure raised one long arm, pointing to the right. "Do we, go?" Nate asked, his voice trembling. "I don't think we have a choice," I said. I turned the wheel, guiding the car down the narrow side road the figure had pointed to. The pavement was rough, cracked, and overgrown with weeds. The headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and the walls of shadows seemed to press closer with every turn. The road led to a clearing, where a single building stood. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. The roof sagged in the middle, and the front door hung open, creaking softly in the breeze. "This is a bad idea," Nate said, gripping my arm. "Do you want to stay in the car?" I asked. He didn't answer. We stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under our feet. The air was colder here, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. The shadows didn't follow us into the clearing, but I could feel them watching, their empty eyes waiting just beyond the tree line. The door swung open wider as we approached, revealing a dimly lit interior. "Are we really going in there?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have a choice," I said, my stomach twisting. The inside of the building was worse than I expected. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood and filled with a dark, oily substance that glistened in the faint light. A single table sat in the center of the room, and on it was something I recognized immediately: the laptop. Nate froze, his breath hitching. "That's my laptop," he said. I didn't know what to say. The screen was on, displaying a single line of text. "Welcome back." The laptop beeped, and new words appeared. "Your experience is not yet complete." "What do we do?" Nate asked, his voice shaking. Before I could answer, the shadows began to seep through the cracks in the walls, crawling toward the table. The screen flickered, and another message appeared. "Choose, submit, or escape." I stared at the words, my mind racing. "What does that mean?" Nate asked, backing away. The shadows surged forward, their movements more frantic, more alive. "We don't have time to figure it out," I said. "We have to choose." Nate grabbed the laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Escape," he said, typing the word as quickly as he could. The shadows froze. For a moment, everything was silent, and then the laptop screen went black. The door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The room was pitch black. I couldn't see Nate, but I could hear him breathing, fast and shallow, like he was on the verge of hyperventilating. My own chest felt tight, my heart slamming against my ribs as I tried to make sense of what was happening. "What just happened?" Nate whispered. His voice was barely audible, swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence around us. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but we need to find a way out." That's when the whispers started. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder, filling the room with overlapping voices, each one low and guttural. "Do you hear that?" Nate asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. The whispers were everywhere, surrounding us, pressing in closer, and then from somewhere in the darkness, a single voice rose above the rest. "Escape comes with a price." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the whispers like a blade. It was cold and hollow, as if it were coming from deep inside the walls. "What price?" Nate asked, his voice trembling. There was no answer. Instead, the shadows began to move again. They spilled out from the corners of the room, crawling across the floor like ink. This time, they didn't stop at the edges. They reached for us. I grabbed Nate's arm, yanking him away from the shadows as they crept closer. The air was freezing now, so cold it burned my lungs with every breath. "We need light," I said, fumbling in my pocket for my phone. The screen flickered to life, casting a faint glow across the room. The shadows recoiled, pulling back into the corners, but they didn't disappear. In the pale light, I saw the table again. The laptop was gone, but in its place was something new, a small, black box. "What is that?" Nate asked, staring at it like it might bite him. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The box seemed to pulse, its surface shifting like liquid. And then, as if sensing our presence, it opened. The box was empty, but something about it made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, like looking into a void that wasn't supposed to exist. And then the whispers came back, louder this time. "Take it," the voice said, echoing through the room. "Take the deal." "What deal?" Nate shouted, his voice cracking. The shadows moved closer, their tendrils stretching toward us. I stepped back, pulling Nate with me, but there was nowhere to go. "Take it, or stay forever," the voice said. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but there was no escape. The door was gone, the windows sealed, and the shadows were closing in. Nate looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. "We don't have a choice," he said. Before I could stop him, he reached for the box. The moment his fingers touched it, the whispers stopped. The shadows froze, their movements suspended like they were caught in time. For a brief, terrible moment, everything was still. And then the box began to change. It shifted in Nate's hands, its surface rippling like water. The room filled with a low, vibrating hum that made my teeth ache. Nate tried to pull away, but his hands were stuck. The box seemed to latch onto him, its tendrils wrapping around his fingers and wrists. "Help me," he screamed, his voice raw with terror. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him free, but the shadows surged forward, slamming into me like a wave. I hit the floor hard, my head spinning as the room tilted and warped. When I looked up, Nate was gone. The shadows retreated, melting back into the walls. The box lay on the table, its surface smooth and motionless, as if nothing had happened. But I could still hear him. His voice was faint, muffled, like it was coming from far away. "Help me," he said again, his words barely a whisper. "I can't get out." I staggered to my feet, my chest heaving as I stumbled toward the table. The box was cold to the touch, its surface slick and unyielding. "Nate," I called, my voice shaking. The box didn't respond, but the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Leave," the voice said. "The deal is done." I didn't want to leave. Every part of me screamed to stay, to find a way to save Nate. But the shadows were moving again, their tendrils reaching for me. I backed away, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with a cacophony of voices, each one more urgent than the last. "Go," the voice commanded. The shadows surged forward, and I turned and ran. The clearing was gone. The road was gone. I don't know how, but I was suddenly back in my car, the engine humming softly. The shadows were gone, but the coldness lingered, sinking into my bones. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. But when I looked into the rearview mirror, I saw them, the shadows. They were still watching, and from somewhere far away, I could still hear Nate's voice. "Help me." I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Every corner of my mind screamed that if I stopped moving, if I let myself feel safe, the shadows would find me. Nate's voice was still there, faint and distant, like it was caught on the edge of a bad radio signal. I drove with no destination, my headlights cutting through the empty roads, but his words kept repeating in my head. "Help me." But how? Around 3 a.m., I pulled into a rest stop. The parking lot was deserted, the vending machines humming softly in the silence. I stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to think. My phone sat in the passenger seat, its screen dark. I hadn't touched it since leaving Nate's apartment. Every time I thought about picking it up, my chest tightened. What if there was another message, another video? But I couldn't avoid it forever. If I wanted answers, I had to know what was waiting for me. With shaking hands, I unlocked the phone. There was a single notification. It wasn't a call or a text this time. It was a file. The name was a random string of numbers and letters, meaningless on its own. But the thumbnail was worse. It was a picture of Nate, his face twisted in panic, one hand outstretched toward the camera like he was trying to grab something. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Every instinct in my body told me not to open it. But I couldn't stop myself. I tapped the file, and the video began to play. The screen was pitch black at first. No sound, no movement, just an oppressive, suffocating void. Then slowly the image faded in. It was Nate's apartment. The living room, exactly as we'd left it, with the shattered mirror still hanging on the wall. But something was wrong. The shadows were alive. They writhed and twisted, crawling across the floor and walls like living things. In the center of the room, the black box sat on the table, pulsing faintly. And then Nate appeared. He was standing in the corner, his back to the camera. His body looked wrong. Too stiff, too still, like a puppet held up by invisible strings. "Nate," I whispered, as if he could hear me. He turned slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. "They won't let me go," he said, his voice hollow. I froze, my heart pounding. "They want you now," he continued, stepping closer to the camera. "They need someone else." The screen flickered, and suddenly the shadows surged forward, enveloping Nate. He didn't scream, he didn't even move. He just disappeared, swallowed whole by the darkness. The camera zoomed in on the black box, its surface rippling like liquid. A new message appeared across the screen, written in jagged white letters, "One for one." The video ended. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking. One for one. They wanted me to take his place. My chest tightened, panic clawing at my throat. How could I stop this? How could I save Nate? The shadows weren't something I could fight or bargain with. They were everywhere, always watching, waiting. I slammed my phone down on the dashboard, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Think," I muttered to myself. "Think." And then I remembered. The site. I grabbed the phone, scrolling frantically through my browser history. I knew the site had disappeared, but maybe, just maybe, there was a trace of it left. My heart sank when I saw the error message again. This page no longer exists. But below it, in tiny, almost invisible text, was a single link. "Resolve your experience here." I clicked it without thinking. The page that loaded was stark and simple, just like before. "Misfortune Market. Your experience is ongoing. Would you like to escalate or terminate?" Terminate. That was all I cared about. I hit the button, my pulse racing. A message popped up. "Termination requires substitution. One must stay behind." I froze. My chest tightened as the words sank in. It wasn't just Nate they wanted. It was someone. The cursor blinked, waiting for my answer. And then, without warning, the shadows began to seep into the car. They slid across the windows and dashboard, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring the moment. "Choose," the voice said, low and cold. I gripped the phone tighter, my fingers hovering over the screen. And then I did the only thing I could. I hit substitute. The shadows stopped. The air grew still, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then the screen changed, showing a single line of text. "Substitution accepted. Your experience is terminated. Thank you for visiting Misfortune Market." My heart sank as I realized what I'd done. I'd replaced Nate. I don't know how I got home. The drive was a blur, my thoughts racing, my chest heavy with guilt. But when I pulled into my driveway, the shadows were gone. The air was clear, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. Still, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Every now and then I see movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, barely there. And when I close my eyes at night, I hear the whispers. Software, faint. Your turn. I paid for a dark web service that claims to reveal hidden realities. Now my house looks slightly off. I'm not proud of what I did. If I could go back and stop myself, I would. But the thing is, curiosity doesn't come with a rewind button. Once you go down a rabbit hole, it's almost impossible to climb back out. It started like most bad ideas do. Boredom. I was in one of those moods where nothing felt satisfying. TV shows, boring, social media, a cesspool. Even gaming felt repetitive. That's when I stumbled across a post on some obscure forum talking about hidden truths and realities the government doesn't want you to know. Normally I'd roll my eyes and move on, but something about it snagged my attention. Maybe it was the way the poster described their experience, claiming they'd paid for a service on the dark web that opened their eyes to the real world. Or maybe I was just desperate for something interesting. The post included a link, but it wasn't clickable. I had to copy and paste it into Tor, the browser you use to access the dark web. I'd dabbled in the dark web before. Nothing crazy, just browsing out of curiosity, so I wasn't completely clueless. Still, when the site loaded, I hesitated. The page was simple, black background, white text, and a single question at the top. Do you want to see the truth? Underneath it was a button labeled Begin. No flashy graphics, no creepy music, just those 6 words. I told myself it was probably some scam or ARG, alternate reality game, and almost closed the tab. But then I thought, what's the harm? I clicked. The next page asked for a payment, $500 in Bitcoin. Expensive, but not out of reach. I hesitated again. Was I really about to blow $500 on something this sketchy? But the more I thought about it, the more intrigued I became. The site didn't make any outlandish promises. It didn't claim I'd gain superpowers or unlock government secrets. All it said was that it would reveal hidden realities. So, like the idiot I am, I transferred the Bitcoin. After the payment went through, the site displayed a single line of text. Your package will arrive in 3 to 5 days. Keep your eyes open. That was it. No confirmation email, no receipt. Just that cryptic message. I stared at the screen for a while, waiting for something else to happen. When nothing did, I closed the browser and tried to convince myself I hadn't just been scammed. The package arrived 4 days later. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address, just my name and a handwritten note taped to the top. Do not open until you are alone. I brought it inside, my stomach twisting with a mix of excitement and dread. What could possibly be in there? A manual? A USB drive? A bomb? I waited until that evening, after my roommate had left for work. Then with shaking hands, I opened the box. Inside was nothing. Well, not nothing, exactly. There was a single piece of folded paper sitting at the bottom, but that was it. No gadgets, no mysterious artifacts, just paper. I unfolded it and read the message scrawled in messy handwriting. Look closely. You've already begun. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. I even laughed out loud, wondering if I'd just paid $500 for a prank. But as I sat there, staring at the note, I felt strange. The air in the room felt heavier, like I'd just walked into a thunderstorm. My skin prickled, and I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around. but nothing seemed out of place. The living room was the same as always. Worn-out couch, coffee table covered in magazines, the faint hum of the fridge from the kitchen. But then I noticed the clock. It was a cheap analog wall clock, the kind you'd buy at a discount store. But now the hands weren't moving. They were stuck at exactly 9:12, even though my phone said it was almost midnight. Weird, but not impossible. Maybe the battery had died. I decided to ignore it and went to bed. That night, I had the most vivid dream I've ever experienced. I was standing in my living room, but it wasn't my living room. The furniture was there, but it was wrong. The couch was facing the wall instead of the TV. The coffee table was missing, and then there was the clock. It was hanging upside down, and the hands were spinning backward, so fast they were just a blur. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. For a moment I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming. But then I saw the note on my nightstand, the one from the package, and remembered everything. The next morning I realized something was off. At first it was little things. The kitchen chair I'd left tucked under the table was now pushed out. The stack of mail on the counter was slightly crooked, even though I was sure it had been neat the night before. Then, as I walked into the living room, I saw it, the clock. The hands were moving again, but not normally. They were ticking forward, then backward, then forward again, like they couldn't decide which way to go. I took it off the wall to check the battery, but when I opened the back, there wasn't one. It wasn't just the clock, either. The more I looked around, the more I noticed things that didn't make sense. The shadow of the coffee table stretched the wrong way, like the light source had flipped. The painting on the wall, something generic with flowers, was slightly tilted, but no matter how much I tried to fix it, it wouldn't stay straight. Even the air felt different, thicker, harder to breathe. By the time my roommate got home that evening, I was a mess. "Dude, what's wrong with you?" he asked, dropping his bag by the door. I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't find the words. How do you explain something like this without sounding insane? So I just said, "Nothing. I'm fine." But I wasn't. That night, I had another dream. This time, I was standing in my bedroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. But the reflection didn't move when I did. It just stood there, smiling. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My body was sore, my head was pounding, and there was this weird static noise in my ears, like the buzz of an old TV. At first, I chalked it up to the dream, if you could even call it that. But the more I moved around, the more I noticed how wrong everything felt. The air in my house was heavier than usual, like someone had cranked up the humidity even though it was the middle of winter. The lights seemed dimmer too, even though every bulb was working fine. But the worst part was the mirror. It was one of those cheap full-length ones you can stick to the back of a door. I'd had it for years, and I never thought twice about it until now. The reflection looked slower. At first I thought I was imagining things, but as I raised my hand to scratch my face, I noticed a slight delay in the mirror. Just a fraction of a second, like it was trying to catch up. I tested it a few times, waving my arms and turning my head, and every time there was a tiny lag. My stomach churned. The day only got weirder from there. I went into the kitchen to make coffee, but when I opened the cabinet, all the mugs were gone. Not broken or misplaced, just gone. I checked every shelf, even the dishwasher, but there was no trace of them. Instead, the cabinet was filled with these glass jars I'd never seen before. They were all identical, with no labels, and they were empty except for a faint mist swirling inside. I shut the cabinet, my hands shaking. The living room was next. It looked mostly the same as it had the day before, but there were little differences that didn't make sense. The couch had shifted slightly to the left. The rug was a shade darker than I remembered. And the clock? The hands were spinning wildly now, faster than the eye could follow. I wanted to smash it, to throw it out the window and be done with it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Every time I got close, my chest tightened, like some invisible force was warning me to stay away. By the time noon rolled around, I was on edge. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that maybe I'd just been too stressed lately, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had changed. I decided to take a walk, get some fresh air, and clear my head. But as I stepped outside, I realized the world outside my house wasn't right either. The street was quieter than usual. Normally there'd be cars driving by, people walking their dogs, kids playing in their yards. But today, the street was empty. No cars, no people, not even the sound of birds. And the sky, it was gray, but not cloudy, just flat, like someone had painted it over. I walked a few blocks, my heart pounding harder with every step. I passed houses I'd seen 100 times before, but they felt unfamiliar now, like copies of themselves. The windows were too dark, the lawns too perfect, the driveways empty. I stopped in front of a house I swore belonged to an elderly couple who always waved when I walked by. Today, the curtains were drawn, and the front door was slightly ajar. Something told me not to go inside. I turned around and hurried back to my house, praying that things would look normal when I got back. They didn't. As soon as I stepped through the door, I knew something was different. The air was colder, almost icy, and the house was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I tried to convince myself I was just imagining it. I went to the living room, turned on the TV, and flipped through the channels. That's when I noticed the news. The anchor on the screen was smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced, like someone had stretched his mouth. His voice was calm, almost monotone, as he said, "Good afternoon. Everything is fine. Do not be alarmed." The words sent a chill down my spine. I changed the channel, but every station was the same. Smiling anchors, wide eyes, and those same words. Everything is fine. Do not be alarmed. I turned off the TV, my hands shaking. I tried calling my roommate. He'd been gone all day, working the late shift, and I needed to tell him what was happening. But when I dialed his number, the call didn't go through. Instead, there was a low buzzing sound, followed by a voice I didn't recognize. "You should not have looked," it said. The line went dead. At this point, I didn't know what to do. My house didn't feel like my house anymore, and even the world outside seemed wrong. I thought about leaving, driving somewhere, anywhere, but the idea of stepping back out into that gray, empty world terrified me. So I stayed. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard something downstairs. It wasn't loud, just a faint creak, like someone stepping on an old floorboard. I told myself it was nothing, just the house, settling. But then it came again, closer this time. Creak, creak. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I crept to the bedroom door and opened it, peering out into the hallway. The light from my phone barely reached the stairs, but I could see enough to know that something was there. A figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, perfectly still. It was shaped like a person, but it wasn't moving. It didn't even look like it was breathing. And then, without warning, it started to climb. I froze at the top of the stairs, clutching my phone like it was a weapon. The figure below moved slowly, deliberately, its steps unnaturally precise. Even with the dim light from my phone, I couldn't make out its face, if it even had one. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, and its movements were almost mechanical, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. It didn't answer. Step by step, it climbed, the floor creaking softly beneath its weight. My mind raced. Should I run, hide, fight? But my body refused to move. It was halfway up the stairs when it stopped. For a moment, the house went completely silent. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven, and the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then it turned its head toward me. The angle was wrong, too sharp, too sudden. My phone's flashlight caught its eyes, and they reflected the light like glass. "Why did you look?" it said. Its voice wasn't loud, but it was impossibly deep, like a sound that came from the walls themselves. I don't remember deciding to run. 1 second I was frozen at the top of the stairs. The next, I was slamming my bedroom door and locking it. I backed away, clutching my phone, and tried to catch my breath. My heart was racing so fast, I thought it might explode. The silence returned, thicker this time, like the house was holding its breath. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then the handle turned. The door didn't open, but the handle twisted back and forth, rattling softly against the lock. "Why did you look?" The voice came again, muffled but still impossibly loud. I stumbled back, my legs hitting the edge of the bed. My phone's screen lit up with a notification, but I didn't dare look away from the door. The rattling stopped, replaced by a soft tapping. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was slow and deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers against the wood. "Why did you look?" This time, the voice sounded closer, like it was right next to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, then ran to the window. My room was on the second floor, and jumping wasn't exactly appealing, but staying here wasn't an option. I fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get it open. The cool night air hit me like a slap, and I swung my legs over the sill, glancing down at the lawn below. It wasn't far, maybe a 10-foot drop, but the shadows on the ground seemed deeper than they should have been, like the grass wasn't just grass anymore. A loud thud from the door snapped me out of it. The thing outside wasn't tapping anymore. It was pounding, each hit sending vibrations through the floor. I didn't think. I jumped. I landed hard, my ankle twisting beneath me. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and limped toward the street, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When I reached the sidewalk, I turned back to look at the house. The window I'd jumped from was still open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. But the thing wasn't there. The pounding had stopped. And yet the house felt alive. The windows seemed darker than before, like the glass was absorbing the light from the street lamps. The front door creaked open just a crack, enough to show a sliver of shadow beyond. I waited, my heart in my throat, expecting the figure to step out. But nothing happened. I limped down the street, unsure of where to go. My roommate wasn't home, and I wasn't about to explain this to a neighbor, so I did the only thing I could think of. I called an Uber and got out of there. The driver didn't ask questions, though I'm sure I looked like a mess. He dropped me off at a 24-hour diner a few miles away, and I spent the rest of the night nursing a cup of coffee and trying to figure out what the hell was happening. By the time the sun came up, I'd made a decision. I was going back to the house. As much as I wanted to stay as far away as possible, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wasn't enough. Whatever I'd invited into my life, it wasn't going to let me go that easily. When I arrived, the house looked normal. The windows weren't dark anymore, and the front door was closed. The air still felt heavy, but not as oppressive as it had the night before. I stepped inside, half expecting to see the figure waiting for me. But the house was empty. Empty, except for the box. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, the same box I'd received from the dark web. But now, there was something else inside. A mirror. It was small, handheld, with an ornate silver frame that looked out of place in my cheap kitchen. A piece of paper was taped to the glass, with a single line written in the same messy handwriting as before. "This is your final chance to look away." I stared at the mirror, my reflection staring back at me. It looked normal, but when I reached out to touch it, my reflection didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the mirror. My reflection looked fine, almost. But there was something about it, something I couldn't put into words. It felt like watching someone trying to act like me, someone just slightly off script. Its eyes seemed too focused, the tilt of its head just a fraction wrong. And the longer I stared, the more it felt like it was staring back. I picked up the mirror, careful not to touch the glass, and peeled the note off the front. The writing on the paper was messier than before, as if whoever wrote it had been in a rush. "Look closely. The truth reveals itself." My stomach twisted. I didn't want to know the truth. Not anymore. But I'd come this far, hadn't I? I'd paid for this, gone down this path willingly. I tilted the mirror slightly, catching more of my reflection. The kitchen behind me seemed darker in the glass, as if the mirror were looking at a different version of my house. And then it moved. Not me, the reflection. I dropped the mirror like it had burned me. It clattered onto the counter, the glass somehow unbroken. The reflection in the mirror turned toward me, even though I wasn't looking at it anymore. It tilted its head slowly, as if studying me. "Why did you look?" it whispered. The voice wasn't loud, but it sent a cold spike of fear down my spine. I stumbled back, my hip bumping into the corner of the counter. The mirror stayed perfectly still, but the figure in the glass began to move closer, its eyes locked onto mine. "I didn't mean to," I stammered. I didn't know." The reflection smiled. It wasn't my smile. The air in the house grew colder, the kind of cold that cut straight to the bone. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my chest felt tight, like the walls were pressing in. The mirror began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that made my teeth ache. The figure in the reflection raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. My muscles felt like they were locked in place, like I was frozen in time. The reflection placed its hand against the inside of the glass, its palm pressed flat. And then I felt it, cold, sharp, and very real. It was touching me. The pressure on my chest grew stronger, and for a moment I thought I was going to pass out. My vision blurred, and the sound of the humming filled my ears, drowning out my own panicked breathing. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the pressure stopped. I gasped, stumbling back into the fridge. The mirror was still on the counter, its surface now blank. No reflection, no figure. Just an empty, dark void. I grabbed a dish towel and threw it over the glass, not daring to look at it again. I spent the next hour pacing the house, trying to convince myself that I was still in control. But no matter where I went, I felt like I was being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, more alive. The sound of the humming lingered, faint but constant, like it was coming from the walls themselves. And then I heard the footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, coming from upstairs. I froze in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, moving down the hallway above me. They didn't sound hurried, just steady, like someone was taking their time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment the house was silent again, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Then the voice came, muffled but clear. "Why did you look?" It was coming from my bedroom. I don't know what possessed me to move, but I found myself climbing the stairs, one shaky step at a time. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time I reached the landing, I could see my breath in front of me. The door to my bedroom was open, just enough for a sliver of darkness to spill out. "Hello?" I whispered. No response. I pushed the door open, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam swept across the room, illuminating the familiar clutter. Clothes on the floor, my unmade bed, the cracked full-length mirror on the back of the door. Everything looked normal, until I saw the figure in the corner. It was standing perfectly still, its back to me, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight shaking so badly the beam wavered. As the light hit the figure, I realized it wasn't casting a shadow. "Why did you look?" it said again, its voice hollow and echoing. The figure turned slowly, and I felt my stomach drop. It was me, or at least it looked like me. The face was identical, but the eyes were wrong. They were dark, empty, like two bottomless pits. "You shouldn't have looked," it said, stepping closer. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The house felt alive around me. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows stretched toward me, clawing at my heels. I burst out the front door, not stopping until I was halfway down the street. Only then did I turn back, gasping for breath. The house was dark, its windows empty, but in the second-floor window I saw it, my reflection, staring down at me with that same twisted smile. I stood in the middle of the street, staring at the second-floor window of my house. My reflection, or whatever it was, stared back, its grin impossibly wide. The longer I looked, the more I felt like I was being pulled toward it, like its gaze was reaching into my mind, rooting itself in a place it didn't belong. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. I needed to get out of there. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing on the empty street. I didn't have a plan. My phone was still in the house, my wallet too, but none of that mattered. I just needed to get as far away as possible. I ended up at an all-night diner on the other side of town. It was one of those places where the fluorescent lights buzzed, and the smell of burnt coffee hung in the air. The waitress gave me a weird look when I walked in, probably because I looked like I'd just crawled out of a war zone, but she didn't say anything. I slid into a booth near the back and stared blankly at the table, my thoughts racing. What was I supposed to do? Call the cops? Tell them my reflection had come to life? They'd laugh me out of the station, but I couldn't go back. I was still trying to piece together my next move when a man slid into the booth across from me. I didn't recognize him at first. He looked normal enough, middle-aged, slightly balding, wearing a cheap suit that didn't quite fit. But there was something about his eyes that made me uneasy. They were too sharp, too focused, like he already knew everything about me before I'd said a word. "You shouldn't have looked," he said, his voice calm but firm. My blood ran cold. "Who are you?" He ignored my question, pulling a small envelope from his pocket and sliding it across the table. "Take it," he said. "What is this?" I asked, my hands shaking as I picked it up. "Instructions," he replied. "If you want to fix this, follow them exactly. No shortcuts, no questions." I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting was the same as the note that had come with the package. Step 1, return to the house. Step 2, break all mirrors. Step 3, burn the package. "Why should I trust you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Because if you don't, it will replace you." The word replace hit me like a brick. My reflection, that thing in the house, wasn't just mimicking me. It was trying to become me. I glanced back down at the note, my heart racing. The steps seemed simple enough, but the thought of going back to that house, of facing whatever was waiting for me, made my stomach churn. "I can't do this," I said, my voice cracking. "You don't have a choice," the man said, standing up. "But don't wait too long. It gets stronger every second you hesitate." Before I could respond, he walked out of the diner, leaving me alone with the envelope and a sinking sense of dread. I don't remember the drive back to the house. My body was on autopilot, my mind racing with what-ifs. When I pulled up to the driveway, the house looked darker than before. The windows were like empty sockets, and the air around it felt wrong. The streetlights flickered as I stepped out of the car, the sound of the gravel crunching under my feet unnaturally loud. I gripped the hammer I'd brought with me, my hands trembling. The note had said to break all the mirrors, and I wasn't taking any chances. The house greeted me with silence. Not the kind of peaceful silence you find late at night, but the oppressive kind that feels alive, like something is waiting for you to speak first. I started in the living room. The first mirror was small, hanging on the wall near the door. I smashed it without hesitation, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the house. For a moment I thought I saw something in the shards, a flash of movement, a shadow, but it was gone before I could be sure. I moved from room to room, breaking every mirror I could find. The hallway, the bathroom, the guest room, they all went the same way. Glass shattered, shards scattered, shadows flickering at the edges of my vision. When I reached my bedroom, I hesitated. The full-length mirror on the back of the door was cracked, but still intact. My reflection stared back at me, its head tilted slightly, that same twisted smile plastered across its face. I raised the hammer, my hands shaking. "Why did you look?" it whispered. I didn't answer. I brought the hammer down as hard as I could, the glass exploding into 1,000 pieces. The house groaned, the sound deep and guttural, like it was alive. I ran back to the kitchen, grabbing the package and the matches I'd left on the counter. The box felt heavier now, almost like it didn't want to be moved. I took it outside, dumping it in the fire pit I hadn't used in years. As I struck the match, I heard it again. "Why did you look?" The voice was coming from the house, from every window, every corner. It was louder now, more insistent, overlapping with itself like a chorus. I threw the match onto the box, watching as the flames consumed it. The voice screamed, a sound so loud and piercing it made my ears ring. And then, silence. I stayed outside until the sun came up, too afraid to go back inside. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the house was normal. The mirrors were gone, the shadows were just shadows, and the air felt light again. But every now and then, when I catch my reflection in a window or a puddle, I swear it's still watching me. And sometimes, just before I look away, I see it smile.